We're going to talk about the future world of work, perhaps one where we'll float around flying cities in jetpacks, where everyone, in fact, will wear white pants. Now, unfortunately for you all, as we stand before lunch for you, we'll be talking more soberly about how we see the world of workplace actually informing some macro-level thinking about real estate and property. Ben.
And we do promise to canter through it. Now, we're going to use this simple diagram throughout, and this is to talk about the traditional approach to office procurement for occupiers, which sounds a little boring, but it's not. So you grow over time, you take on more people, you grow your revenues, and you grow your space. And that's essentially the model that we've seen for the past couple of 100 years. Absolutely fine. But with all the things that we've heard about this morning, I would expect that we'll see that changing, and that we'll see evidence within the market that people are doing things differently, that there is a different kind of demand coming into the market. So we've gone globally and spoken to our sort of lead agents and brokers in key markets and asked them what they're seeing from their occupier clients. So I'm going to turn to Stu Eisencraft in New York. And Stu, surely we're seeing a change in demand. We're seeing occupiers doing things differently.
You're making the assumption that all corporations have become more adept and agile, and frankly speaking, I don't see that being the case. People have right-sized, they've set up standards, but that's been going on for quite a while. So the arbitrage between the theoretical workplace strategy and a real estate trend, the linkage there is fuzzy in many places.
That's disappointing to hear, but then we all know Americans like their space. No offense, Lenny. So it must be different in Asia, right? People must be doing things differently over there. They're agile, they're aggressive, they work differently. So let's turn to John Falconer, who's our lead in Asia Pacific.
You know, the markets of Asia are very volatile. What goes up goes down extremely quickly. And, you know, the old fundamentals are absolutely applied here. It's all about demand and supply. And until tenants fundamentally demand something that is really that different to standard office space, no, I don't think there'll be any great change to either lease terms or the cost base.
So wait a second, Stu and John, because I'm a workplace strategist. I would presume that we've seen significant change. I would say that we've seen a difference in supply, that we've seen changes in terms in which organizations are committing to, and that the product itself is substantially different. But let's challenge those assumptions. One of the things that we do a lot at CB is econometrics around how people occupy space. And we would look on a global basis. Most regions kind of look like this, where you see office stock increasing over time, largely predictively based on increase in headcount on payroll. What's interesting, this is actually from the US, from my region. And what you actually see is the efficiency decreasing over time. So what you're actually seeing is that the square foot occupied across all of the US is actually increasing net to net, about 15% over the last 30 years. The converse is actually true of the London market. We see it slightly declining, but only slightly, about 10%. So really, supply actually does follow headcount demand. When we think about a span of 30 years of how much has actually changed in terms of technology and innovation, wouldn't we think that that actually would look very different, but it does not?
One thing we often hear from our clients is that it's the leasing structure that causes us to have issues. The leasing structures are inflexible. That's what we hear in the London market, where, as you can see on the left, we have a standard lease term of around 10 years. But when you look down the line at very sophisticated real estate markets in other locations, they have greater flexibility, as I'm sure a lot of you will know, around lease terms and so on. But we haven't actually seen that turn into different ways of taking on space and being very agile in the way that people are using space.
And finally, around the product itself, Alistair had a great example of showing the two different versions of work historically. When we look at this over the span of 30 years, and again, when we think about all that's changed in terms of building technology, infrastructure, ubiquitous communication, seamless mobility, you would think that the actual aspect of placemaking would change greatly. But if we look at what was innovative in 1939 and we look at today what's innovative in Palo Alto, from a place perspective, when we strip away the fashion, it doesn't look decidedly different. In fact, what probably happened is in between it got pretty bad, with a lot of cubicles.
So then, within the context of this, we're not saying there's no change coming, and in fact what we'd like to do is start talking about what are the factors that indicate there may be a tipping point. So what are the key indicators that we can look at to see whether actually things are going to change, whether there is going to be a break in these things?
So one of the things that we're often asked to solve for is actually how do we drive cost out? So people start with the dollar that they spend on real estate, and they say, how can I actually reduce the baseline that I pay for my corporate facilities? And we can come in and I think look with some certainty that we can save 30 to 40% of the cost basis. We can just be more efficient in using an underutilized asset more intensely. But what we see is when we look at the overall dollar that's spent on the organization, that real estate actually is the minority. It's the small part of the spend, often between 10 and 12%. And so really the much bigger component is the people aspect. And so when we think about what's changing from the workforce expectations, we actually see a disaggregation, employees driving significant change around their work experiences. A lot of what we heard about earlier around the jelly bean work. And what we see leading that are these trends, which really are all driven around flexibility, convenience, choice, and comfort. Employees are demanding this. So the things that we know, great places to work offer more flexibility. Workers are demanding a more flexible and connected experience. And there was a recent study, I know Cisco's in the audience, of Cisco's global research report. 3 in 5 workers believe they can be more productive outside the office or as productive in the office. 3 of 5. A majority of people feel like they can be as productive outside of the office. That's significant. Work is increasingly collaborative, requiring much greater agility. We're working beyond the traditional norms, even within our own teams. What we see is actually teams partnering in new ad hoc formations, requiring a very agile environment and platform to support that. And finally, I think we all have come to realize we are already mobile. Gartner Research, IDC, others have reported on this widely. So we see significant change, but let's give some evidence to that specifically around the worker demand. One of the things that we do is we survey organizations about their priorities as we investigate workplace opportunities. And what you see behind me is some recent work that we've been doing with the Coca-Cola Company, where we talked to about 5,000 employees at their corporate headquarters. And we asked them to prioritize what was most important to them as we think about the future of their work environment. And we put all things that we thought would be preferred alternatives: the convenience and comfort of having an assigned desk, the ability to work away from the office, access at customer locations. And then we ranked that across all of the employees at Coke. And what we found actually surprised us. Coke is a very traditional occupier of space. Everyone has an assigned desk, very hierarchical and entitlement driven. But we found at the very top of the list, and in this chart, high means good, means highly preferred, low means less preferred. Flexibility and choice to work away from the office was the significant feature in their request. So then they asked us to segregate it by different demographics. And what we actually found is that it didn't segregate that greatly, that we actually don't see significant differences in what is basically good for employees. I mean, everybody wants the same thing, whether you're a baby boomer, whether you're Gen X, or whether you're a millennial. It's really how we educate and prepare people for that experience. But certainly we see flexibility as the primary feature. Another aspect is when we think about historically risk-averse industries like banks and banking in the financial service sector, we see significant uptick in alternative officing programs. I think we all are commonly aware of this. But if we look at 3 organizations within the next 2 years, they forecast over 10% of their collective employee base will be working without an assigned desk. That's significant. We've often thought management consulting and technology companies really led the charge. We're seeing all players adopting much more flexible ways of approaching their premises.
So what can we say about the impact that that may have, and where are we going to go? I think in the past we've looked at kind of 2 models, and our approach is to say that we've got this molten core, which in the past may have been the HQ, but the HQ is a depository for a lot of process-oriented functions. And then you have the people warehouse, which is the chicken coop.
Which is tyranny.
Tyranny, that's right, tyranny. And one of the things that we think we can move away from over time is this idea of the people warehouse being potentially provided at all times by the corporate occupiers themselves. And if we move forward. So what we're seeing a lot of people planning to do or beginning to do, Paul referred to it around what PwC have already done, is reducing the waste. And the waste is what Philip referred to earlier about the underutilization of space. If you take 3 key office markets in the world, Paris, London, and New York, you have over 1 billion square feet of space in those office markets. Now, if you equate that to desks and you say, let's take away the underutilized desks, we can basically get rid of all the office space in London because we don't need it if you join those cities up. So that's the level that we're talking about of wastage. And again, from a corporate occupier's point of view, there's a question for us about what kind of space do you want to be running and do you want to be looking after? And so if we follow through on some of the trends that Lenny's talked about, we've asked Marianne Tai, who leads our New York office, what she's seeing in her market around those changes at a social level.
I see people now looking very hard at quality of life issues as we see the developing world emerge as a really important economic force. Suddenly, there are many other places where talent can go, and there isn't enough talent to cover the demand.
So we've got this broadening, this idea of globalization, although that can be taken with a pinch of salt for those of you that try and act globally, you'll know the difficulties around that. However, this element of choice that's coming in, and I want to touch briefly on this, I won't delay too long, you'll be glad, but some research that's been done by the World Values Survey, I don't know how many of you ever read it, it's fascinating, look at these two stages of development across economies. And a chap called Ronald Inglehart identified these two things and has been working on this for about 3 decades now. And in the first stage of development, unsurprisingly, people focus on economic gains. What's important is security, is making money, is looking after your family, etc. Now, as that becomes a given, i.e. with the technology thing, you assume it's going to work, you assume that you can do those things, you don't have to protect your economic gains in quite the same way. You move into a lifestyle focus where choice becomes more important and the nice-to-haves become drivers for the way that you operate. And we can see here, again, from Cisco, 3 of 5 workers would choose jobs that were lower paid but had leniency in working outside of the office. So there is an appetite within these developed economies to change the way that we're working. And we're seeing that driving behavior, as we've already heard today. And so our view is that the modern office is going to be the Large Hadron Collider. You are all particles. We've got some big magnets outside. We're going to experiment with this later. We're going to shoot you around the plaza at the British Library and see how much energy we can create by smashing you together. Energy, in this rather strange analogy and metaphor, is about the way that people interact and where value is created for organizations. And we see that being within these intimate and serendipitous interactions. Now, how do you create space for that? And our view is that corporates will focus their efforts in terms of space on enabling those interactions in some key locations, whether it's the Cube, whether it's your headquarters building, although we think that we're seeing new shapes of headquarters coming, and that you will focus the space, as was asked about earlier, on enabling that kind of interaction. We still think that physical interaction is not going to be usurped by the ability of technology to allow us to tell each other when we're online. We don't see that is actually mutually exclusive. We think, though, that the focus from a property perspective is for corporates going to be on providing each of you a lovely Hadron Collider.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important, what we hear from our customers is that it's no longer viable to present a brand to the marketplace around innovation or connectivity or collaboration and then do something decidedly different inside the 4 walls of your organization. That there has to be authenticity. In a world that we live in that's so highly connected, people know what happens inside organizations. We now have a view into the world of work at many places that we couldn't imagine having that similar level of intimate view 10 or 15 years ago. Companies will increasingly look to align how they actually manage their brand internally and externally